Take a look at your objectives for today. By the end of class, you should be able to tell me how sound is being produced. You should be able to explain why sound travels at different speeds in different objects. And you should be able to explain how your ear allows you to hear. These objectives are always important, but they're especially important today because the scope of material that we are covering is large. You're going to get a lot of information today, and it's likely that at the end of class, you're going to say to yourself, how do I know if I picked up anything that I'm supposed to pick up in this class? This is how. These objectives tell you what I expect you to have gotten out of this lesson. If you cannot do these 3 things at the end of class, then you did not pick up the things you were supposed to pick up. If you can do them, then you're in good shape. Okay? And if for some reason you get to the end and you cannot do these things, that's when you should be asking for help. Okay? All right. So be thinking about these 3 objectives as we progress through the notes, and also be thinking about those agree-disagree statements that we covered in our bell ringer. Be listening for the answers of whether or not you were correct to disagree or to agree. Sound is energy that's traveling in the form of a wave. So in the previous chapter, we talked a lot about different types of energy, and we discussed that some of them do travel as waves. Sound is one of those types. Sound is produced when objects vibrate. So right here, just a couple seconds into the notes, we have the answer to one of our agree-disagree statements. It was correct to agree with the first statement that sound is produced when objects vibrate. And we have the answer to our first objective. How is sound produced? When objects are made to vibrate. Yeah. Vibrating objects are going to push matter together into compressions.
Whoa.
So what happens is that object runs into the particles of another object and causes them to get pushed together because the energy moves those particles, and then those particles transfer that energy to the particles next to them, and they return to where they were originally. When those particles are moving back and they spread out, they form what we call rarefactions, or areas where there are few particles, where the particles are very, very spread out. So there's a couple of different ways that you can imagine this visually. Sometimes we draw them as bands of particles that are very close together, and then areas where particles are more spread out with other bands of particles that are close together, and then bands of particles that are more spread out from each other. So this is one way that we imagine them. So this right here would be a compression, and this area where it's spread out would be a rarefaction. And these are formed because there's an object vibrating, and it runs into those particles and compresses them, and then they run into particles and compress those, and the process continues. So the matter doesn't actually move from place to place. It vibrates in place, but the energy is transferred from object to object, and so the energy moves through the system. Because these compressions and rarefactions move in the same direction that the wave is traveling, sound waves are considered longitudinal waves. If you think about a water wave that moves like this, the water is moving up and down, but the wave is moving side to side. Okay, that is not a longitudinal wave. What we have with the sound waves is that both the matter and the wave are moving in the same direction, and that's what makes them longitudinal. And an important thing to note about longitudinal waves is that they can only travel through matter. So sound has to have matter to travel through. We talked about this a little bit yesterday when we were doing the lab, that here on Earth, even in this open, empty space between us, there is matter. Because there is air, we have an atmosphere. Therefore, sound is able to travel from me to you through that air. It's not traveling through empty space. In outer space, where there's no air between particles of dust and other space junk, then it can't travel because there's no matter for it to travel through. In order for sound to move, something has to vibrate. And if there's nothing to vibrate, then that object or then that sound cannot travel. Sound is going to travel at different speeds in different materials. In solids, sound moves the fastest. It moves the second fastest in liquids, and it moves the slowest in a gas. The reason for this is because of how close those particles are to each other. In a solid, you've got these particles that are very close to each other. They're bonded very tightly, and so it's very easy for them to run into each other, right? And pass that energy. In a liquid, the particles may be just a little bit more spread out and able to slide past each other a little more easily. So while it's still fairly easy for those particles to bump into each other, it's not as easy as in a solid. In a gas, those particles are even further spread out, which means it's going to take a lot more time for one of them to run into another one. That's why it moves the fastest in a solid and the slowest in a gas, because it's just going to take longer for those particles to run into each other. As temperature increases, in general, the speed of sound also increases. And this again has to do with those particles running into each other. The more energy a particle has, energy that it gets from heat, so as its temperature increases, their energy increases, then the faster that particle is going to move, and as a result, the easier and the quicker it will run into another particle. That's why, as temperature increases, the speed of sound also increases. So if you'll notice, we've just answered our second objective for the day. Sound waves are all different from each other. You know this intuitively because you know that when you listen to sounds around you, they don't all sound the same. So you know they must be different from each other. There are a few ways in which they are different, and we're going to cover 3 of them right now. The first one is they have different wavelengths. A wavelength is the distance between a point on a wave and the same point on the next wave. If we were drawing this as a water wave, your wavelength would be the distance between one point and the same point on the next wave. Since we are not looking at water waves, we're looking at compressional waves, we're going to draw this a little bit differently. We're going to draw an area where the particles are very close together, and then an area where they're spread out. This sort of slinky looking wave is the standard for how we draw them. So on this, one wavelength would be the distance between a compression and a compression, or the distance between a rarefaction and another rarefaction. Okay. So we're going to count that as a wavelength. Large objects are going to vibrate slowly. Because they're vibrating slowly, the areas of compression are going to be very far apart, and as a result, they're going to have long or large wavelengths. Smaller objects vibrate much more quickly, and they produce shorter wavelengths because of it. Frequency is the number of waves that pass a point in a given amount of time. Usually the amount of time we use is 1 second. So you can imagine this like a finish line over here, and what's going to happen is we're going to take these waves that are moving through here, and we're going to measure how many of these compressions are able to pass by this point during 1 second. And that would be your frequency. So if 3 of them could go past, you would say it would be 3 cycles per second. 3 wavelengths passing in 1 second. And the unit we use for this is hertz, which is abbreviated HZ. Okay? The shorter the wavelength is, the more of those wavelengths are able to go past in 1 second. Therefore, the smaller the wavelength, the higher the frequency. These have what we call an inversely proportional relationship. As one of them increases, the other one decreases. So if we increase the wavelength, we decrease the frequency. Fewer cycles per second. Our ears perceive the frequency of objects as their pitch. So objects that have a high frequency or a small wavelength are perceived as high-pitched, and objects that have a low frequency or a large wavelength are perceived as low pitch. Humans can hear frequencies anywhere between 20 and 20,000 hertz. This is a decently wide range, but there are animals that can hear frequencies higher than this, for example, dogs. And there are elephants who can hear frequencies lower than this, for example, elephants. Okay? So we do not possess the entire range. There we hear the answer to our second agree-disagree. We do not, in fact, hear the entire range. We don't have the widest range of animals out there. There are animals that can hear sounds higher and lower than us. Amplitude is the last one we're going to talk about. Amplitude is a measure of how close together particles are in a compression and how far apart they are in a rarefaction. So, if you have a wave where the particles are packed really, 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 really tightly together and then spread out really, really, really far apart, that has a larger amplitude than one where they are just moderately tightly together and moderately spread apart. Okay, so it's not a measure of how far apart these compressions are, and it's not a measure of we're not measuring wavelength here. What we're measuring is how tightly packed is this and how far spread apart is this. Okay? If it has a tighter compression, then the amplitude is greater. This is important because amplitude is a measure for us of how much energy is in a wave. If something has more energy, it will have a greater amplitude. All right, we've now talked about all the differences in sound. We've talked about why they move slower in certain substances than other, and we've talked about what causes them. Now we're going to move on to talking about how we hear them. Okay. There are a series of processes or structures in your ears that allow you to change vibration into electrical signals that your brain can interpret. We're going to go through those processes and we're going to break them up into 3 sections: the ones in your outer ear, the ones in your middle ear, and the ones in your inner ear. We're going to work outside in, okay, as we go from the exterior of your head to the nerve that sends the signals to your brain. So, beginning in the outer ear, you have the pinna, which is this cartilaginous piece that's on the outside that is probably what you associate with your ear, okay? And its whole job is to funnel sound waves into your ear canal, the opening of which you can see in the center. It's shaped the way it's shaped to help sounds get into your ear. You can see how this works. If you cup your ear or your hand around your ear, you'll notice that sounds appear louder as you speak, and that's because you're just magnifying how much of this shape is on your ear. So that's its job, is to funnel that sound into your ear canal. Then you have your ear canal, the other part of your outer ear. And this is just a canal that runs from your ear to your middle ear, and it is what controls that sound getting into your ear. So it's just this space. Okay. So in your outer ear, you just have your pinna and your ear canal. By the time we reach the end of the ear canal and we hit the eardrum, we've hit the first structure of the middle ear. In the middle ear, the first structure we run into is the eardrum. The eardrum is this thin membrane that's stretched over the end of your ear canal, and when sound hits it, it begins to vibrate. Your eardrum helps keep stuff out of your inner ear, but it also transfers those vibrations to the next pieces of your ear, which are the 3 small bones that are in your middle ear. These bones' scientific names are the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, or stapes, however you choose to say it, but they're more commonly known as the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, names given to them because of their shapes, which you are welcome to look up and take a look at. These 3 small bones have an important job, and that's not just to pass the vibrations from the eardrum to the cochlea. Their job is to amplify that sound before they pass it on. Amplify means to make greater or to make stronger. So their job is to make those vibrations stronger before they pass them on to the inner ear. So the structures of your middle ear would be your eardrum and the 3 small bones of the ear. And then we have the inner ear, the last section, and this just contains the cochlea. The cochlea is basically a hollowed out space in the bone of your skull that is full of fluid and full of hair cell receptors. When the vibrations from the ear bones are passed to the cochlea, it begins to vibrate, and as it vibrates, the fluid inside of it also vibrates. Inside the cochlea, those tiny hair cells are moved by that moving fluid. So you can think of it kind of like you have this opening, and sticking off of the walls of that opening are these hair cells. And as the liquid moves back and forth, they also move back and forth, sort of like seaweed in an ocean. As that fluid is moved, then they move as well. And when they move, they send electrical signals to your brain, and your brain interprets those signals as sounds. So depending on the frequency of the vibrations, certain hair cells will vibrate and certain hair cells will not, and as a result, your brain is able to interpret pitch of sound for you. What's really incredible about this whole process is that it's happening very, very, very quickly, almost instantaneously for you. I speak, you hear and understand what I'm saying, almost instantaneously. Sound travels very quickly, the vibrations pass through your ear very quickly, and your brain interprets that information very quickly for you. It's all really a very cool process. Before we finish up the notes today, now that we understand how we hear, let's just take a moment to talk a little bit about why it's important. Okay? We use sound for a wide variety of things. Okay? One of those things, one of maybe the most important things we do with it, is communicate. You have vocal cords in your throat. They're essentially small flaps of skin and muscle, which those muscles cause to vibrate, and those vibrations produce sounds of different frequencies, which allows you to speak and produce noise and communicate information with other human beings. On top of communication, we also use sound to locate objects underwater. Sonar machines send sound down to the bottom of the ocean, and then it's reflected back off of objects. And because they know the speed of the sound, they can then calculate the distance that it traveled and locate where objects are. A similar process is done using very high frequency sound, ultrasound, to take images of internal organs. Okay? Those internal organs are soft, and so they need very high frequency sounds to bounce off of them. They use this when women are pregnant to get an image of the baby. They also use it anytime you need imaging of soft internal organs like your stomach or your bladder. They're going to use an ultrasound machine to take imaging of it. So, very useful. All right, this is where our notes end for today.